The second time I missed my train, I told myself it was the cold. The truth was, I'd stood on the platform watching the doors close on an empty seat that wasn't empty at all. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. And I couldn't make my feet carry me toward it. That seat had been open for 6 mornings running. Not open like unclaimed. Open like guarded. The 712 out of Ashford Terminal ran 4 cars deep every weekday, packed shoulder to shoulder with commuters clutching coffee and each other's patience. And yet the aisle seat beside the woman everyone called the Iron Current sat empty morning after morning, while grown adults stood swaying in the vestibule rather than ask if they could take it. I hadn't asked either. I'd just noticed. Counting was a habit I couldn't turn off, not since I was 11 years old watching my father run his thumb down columns of numbers at our kitchen table. And some part of my brain that never stopped working had logged the pattern before I gave it permission to. 6 days, same seat, same woman, same untouched cushion with its small tear at the corner, patched once. Badly, with a thread that didn't match. To understand why an empty train seat felt like something I wasn't allowed to look at directly, I have to go back to that Monday morning, to the coffee. It hit my blouse before the insult did, which was how I knew it was Marcus and not an accident. He'd angled the cup wrong on purpose, the same way he angled everything wrong on purpose when it came to me. And by the time the brown bloom had soaked through to my skin, he was already saying, loud enough for the whole bullpen to hear, that maybe if I watched where I was going, instead of hiding behind spreadsheets all day, I wouldn't keep getting in people's way. Nobody looked up. That was the part that stayed with me longer than the stain did. 22 desks in that office, and not one head turned. Because I had spent 4 years at Halloran Bookkeeping, making myself small enough that my own humiliation didn't even register as noise anymore. I was 27 years old, a documented omega on file with human resources, and I had learned to apologize for the space I took up before anyone asked me to. I went to the supply closet, blotted the stain with a paper towel, and did not cry, because crying cost time I didn't have. My sister Petra had an insulin refill due Thursday, and the pharmacy didn't do payment plans on courtesy. I went back to my desk, and I did the only thing that had ever made the noise in my chest go quiet, which was open the Kessler file nobody else wanted to touch and start finding what didn't add up. It took 40 minutes. The Kessler account had a recurring transfer, small, almost polite in its smallness, routed through a shell vendor that didn't exist anywhere except on paper, bleeding $412 a month from a client who trusted us to notice. I found 3 years of it. $14,832 vanished one polite bite at a time. I brought it to my supervisor. He told me to focus on my actual workload and let the senior staff worry about anomalies. I opened my mouth to explain that anomalies were my actual workload, that I had been quietly correcting other people's blindness for 4 years without a single raise to show for it. And then I closed it again, because I had learned that too. I missed the 6:58 that morning, untangling the argument I never had, and by the time I reached the platform for the 712, the doors were already sliding open on a train that was, as always by then, standing room only. Except for the one seat. I'd seen her before, the way everyone on that line had seen her, a woman who boarded at the Ashford, stop in a coat the color of wet slate, dark hair pulled back hard enough to look like armor, a jaw that could cut glass, and eyes that didn't do the polite thing eyes were supposed to do on public transit, which was avoid you. She read a folded newspaper she never seemed to actually read. She smelled, when the crowd pressed close enough to notice such things, like black spruce and cold iron, a scent so precise it felt engineered, and something in the base of my skull that had nothing to do with manners wanted to lean toward it. Everyone knew who she was by the third week of seeing her ride the commuter line, like a person who could have afforded a private car and chose not to. Adira Voss, the Iron Current, the papers called her, heir and now sole master of Voss Maritime, a shipping empire that moved a third of the continent's freight and had swallowed 6 competitors in 4 years without once raising its own voice to do it. She was 29 and colder than men twice her age, and I had heard 3 different rumors about why the seat beside her stayed empty. That she'd threatened someone, that she paid the conductor, that she simply looked at people in a way that made them remember somewhere else they needed to stand. I did not have somewhere else to stand. My feet hurt, my blouse smelled like burnt coffee, and I had exactly 108 seconds before the doors closed on the only open seat in 4 packed cars. I sat down. The whole car seemed to inhale. I felt it more than heard it, that ripple of attention moving down the aisle, and I kept my eyes on my knees and my bag hugged to my chest like it could shield me from whatever consequence I just volunteered for. The woman beside me did not move, did not look over, did not do anything at all except turn 1 page of a newspaper she wasn't reading. And for 4 stops, I thought, with something close to relief, that I had gotten away with something. At the 5th stop, without turning her head, she said, in a voice pitched low enough that it belonged only to the 2 of us, "You're new to this seat." "I'm sorry," I said, already gathering my bag. "I can move. I didn't ask you to move." Her eyes cut sideways, gray as harbor water before a storm, and something in them made my pulse do an inconvenient, traitorous thing. I asked how long you've been counting the days it sat empty. The train rattled into the tunnel before Kessington Station, and the lights flickered once, and in that half-second of dark, I understood, with the particular dread of someone who has just been caught doing math in public, that she had been counting too. I told myself, on the walk from the station to the office, that it meant nothing. Rich women were strange about their space. I had read that somewhere, in some magazine I'd flipped through in a waiting room. An article about the habits of the very wealthy that I'd absorbed the way I absorbed everything, filed and forgotten until I needed it. It meant nothing that she'd asked. It meant nothing that when I finally worked up the courage to glance at her before my stop, she had already been looking at me and hadn't looked away when I caught her. It meant nothing, and I thought about it for the entire 11-hour shift that followed, through Marcus's 2nd round of comments about spreadsheet girls who thought too highly of themselves, through my supervisor's 3rd dismissal of the Kessler discrepancy, through the long walk back to the station with my feet aching and my mind circling that gray-eyed stare like a moth circling something it knew better than to touch. The next morning, the seat was empty again. I sat down without asking permission because some new, reckless part of me had decided overnight that I was allowed to. She didn't look surprised. She looked, if anything, like a woman confirming an outcome she'd already calculated, and when the train pulled out of the station she said, without preamble, "You found something yesterday. At your office. It's still bothering you. How would you know that?" "Because you've been rubbing the same spot on your wrist for 6 minutes," she said, "the way people do when they're holding numbers they can't put down." I looked at my wrist. I hadn't noticed I was doing it. I looked back at her, at the woman the whole city was afraid of, and something in my chest that had been clenched shut since Monday's coffee loosened by 1 degree, because for the first time in 4 years, someone had looked at me and seen the thing I actually was instead of the thing I'd made myself small enough to be. $14,832, I said. Over 3 years. Nobody wants to hear it. The Iron Current turned the page of her unread newspaper, and something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. "I want to hear it," she said. "Tell me everything." I didn't know it yet, riding the 712 toward a job I would quit within the week, and a woman whose name I would learn to say the way other people said prayers. But that was the morning my life stopped being something that happened to me and started being something I was finally inside of. I told her everything, and by the time the train reached my stop, she had written a phone number on the corner of a newspaper page in handwriting so precise it looked engraved, and told me to call it before I let anyone at Halloran Bookkeeping talk me out of what I'd found. I didn't call it that day. I told myself I wasn't the kind of person who called billionaires off a torn newspaper scrap, that whatever had passed between us on that train was a fluke of proximity and exhaustion, nothing a good night's sleep wouldn't cure. I went home to the apartment I shared with Petra, reheated rice for dinner, and lay awake memorizing the exact gray of a stranger's eyes instead of sleeping. I called it on Thursday, because Thursday was the day Halloran Bookkeeping fired me. They didn't call it that, of course. My supervisor used the word restructuring, and Marcus stood by the coffee station not quite hiding his satisfaction, and I was handed a cardboard box for 4 years of belongings that fit, humiliatingly, into a space the size of a shoebox. Nobody mentioned the Kessler file. I understood, walking out with my box under one arm and my dignity somewhere back at my desk, that I had been let go, not despite finding the discrepancy, but because of it. Because somebody further up the chain had a reason to want $14,832 to stay quiet. I called the number from a bench outside the building, my hands shaking hard enough that I dialed wrong twice. A woman answered on the second ring, not Adira Voss, but someone whose voice had the clipped efficiency of a person paid to filter the world before it reached her employer. When I gave my name, there was a pause exactly 1.5 seconds long, and then the voice said, "Miss Calloway. We were told to expect you might call today, not tomorrow. Can you be at Voss Tower within the hour?" I could. I had, after all, nothing left to be anywhere else for. Voss Tower rose 51 floors over the harbor, all black glass and cold light, the kind of building that seemed to disapprove of the sky around it. The lobby alone could have held my entire apartment twice over. Floors so polished I could see the box of my old life reflected in them. And the security guard who checked my name against a list didn't ask a single question, just nodded once and pressed the button for the top floor himself. Adira Voss's office had windows on 3 sides and furniture that looked like it had never once been sat in carelessly. She stood at the window when I came in, coat gone, sleeves rolled to the forearm. And for a moment I forgot every rehearsed sentence I'd built on the ride over, because up close, without a train car full of strangers between us, she was something else entirely. Not cold, I realized. Coiled, a woman holding a great deal of weight very still. "You brought the file," she said. It wasn't a question. I brought copies. The originals belonged to Halloran. I set my bag down, hands steadier, now that I had numbers to hold on to instead of nerves. They fired me this morning. I don't know if that's because of what I found or because of something else, but the timing feels like an answer. "Show me." I laid the pages across her desk the way I'd laid them across my own kitchen table a dozen times that week, tracing the shell vendor, the recurring transfer, the pattern that repeated itself with the discipline of something designed to never be noticed. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet long enough that I started rehearsing a polite exit. "Halloran Bookkeeping handles 3 of my subsidiary accounts," she said finally. "Kessler Freight is one of them." I didn't know. I don't think anyone was supposed to know. "No." Her jaw tightened, and for the first time I caught the scent shift beneath the black spruce and cold iron, something sharper underneath, almost bitter, the smell of anger held very carefully in check. I think someone counted on nobody looking closely enough to find it. They were wrong about that. She looked up at me, and the gray of her eyes had gone very still, the way water goes still right before it decides what it's going to do. How would you like a job, Miss Calloway? Working for me, finding exactly this kind of thing, wherever it's hiding, for as long as it takes. I'm an Omega, I said, because it needed saying before either of us went further, because I had learned the hard way that the word came with assumptions attached whether I offered it or not. Undesignated staff at Halloran got the interesting work. I got filing. I don't care what you present as. I care that you found in one afternoon what 4 accountants missed for 3 years. She said it the way she seemed to say everything, without decoration, a fact laid flat on the table between us. I'm not offering you filing. I should have asked about salary. I should have asked about hours, about contracts, about the dozen practical things a sensible person asks before she agrees to reorder her entire life on the strength of one train ride and one conversation. Instead, I found myself looking at the small tear in the sleeve of the coat she'd hung by the door, the same coat from the train, patched once with mismatched thread, and thinking that a woman who could afford anything in the world and chose to mend her own coat badly rather than replace it was not, whatever the papers said about her, made entirely of ice. All right, I said. Yes. She held out her hand to shake on it, and when our palms met, I caught her scent full in the face for the first time, without a crowded train car to dilute it. Black spruce and cold iron and, underneath, that thread of something warmer she probably didn't know she let through. And I understood, with the sudden clarity of a woman realizing she has walked through a door she cannot walk back out of, that I had just agreed to spend my days inside the orbit of the most watched, most feared, most talked about woman in the city. Her assistant showed me to what would become my office 2 floors down, a room with a window and a desk that alone was worth more than my rent for a year, and left me alone with a stack of files an inch thick and the beginning of a headache that had nothing to do with numbers. I didn't know yet that within the week I would be crossing that same lobby not as a visitor signed in by a guard with a clipboard, but as staff with my own key card, my own elevator access, my own reserved seat. It turned out later, disguised the whole time as an accident of scheduling. I didn't know that the tear in her coat sleeve would come to mean something to me that I couldn't yet name. I only knew, walking out of Voss Tower that first evening with a job I hadn't gone looking for and a scent I couldn't stop thinking about, that the ground under my life had shifted, and I had no idea yet how far the fall would go before it caught me. The apartment they gave me access to, 3 days into the job, backed onto a floor for visiting executives, and it was larger than the place Petra and I had shared for 6 years combined. I didn't move in. Petra needed me close, needed the insulin schedule and the ride to school, and the particular kind of steadiness only a sister who'd raised her could offer. But I stood in that empty apartment once, running my hand along a marble counter that had never held a dish, and understood the shape of the gap between Adira Voss's life and mine in a way no salary number could have taught me. The staff at Voss Tower noticed me before I'd unpacked a single pen. Not everyone was unkind about it. There was a woman named Priya Okafor, head of the company's internal security, who looked at me the first week like I was a liability that hadn't yet proven its cost, and said as much, bluntly, in the elevator on my second day. She doesn't bring people in like this, Priya said. Her arms were crossed, her stance the particular stillness of someone who had spent a career reading rooms for threats, not employees, not off a train. I found something real, I said. That's why I'm here. That's what you think you're here for. Priya's eyes flicked over me once, assessing, unreadable, "Watch yourself, Miss Calloway." People who get close to her get used as leverage. It's happened before. I didn't ask what she meant by before. I filed it away instead, the way I filed everything, and went to my new office to start pulling threads that Halloran bookkeeping had never wanted pulled. The insiders were worse in smaller ways. A junior analyst named Sinclair made a point of calling me the train girl in a tone that wasn't affectionate, loud enough in the break room that I heard it through the door twice in 1 week. Someone left an unsigned note on my desk suggesting I'd slept my way into the position, and I sat with it for exactly as long as it took to feel the old, familiar heat crawl up my throat, and then I threw it away, because I had learned a long time ago that the people who wrote notes like that never signed them, and unsigned things didn't deserve my grief. What I hadn't expected was the food. It started the second week, a container left on my desk at 11 in the morning with no note attached, still warm. And when I opened it, I found a stew that tasted absurdly, achingly, like something my father used to make on Sunday nights before everything went wrong. Root vegetables, thyme, a particular heaviness of broth I hadn't tasted anywhere in 9 years. I asked Adara's assistant about it and got only a shrug and a redirect to another meeting. It happened again 3 days later. A different dish, but the same uncanny precision. The sense of someone reaching backward through a conversation I barely remembered having and pulling out exactly the right thing. I found her in the executive kitchen on the 9th floor on the 4th occurrence, sleeves rolled, doing something with a pan that no CEO of a shipping empire had any business knowing how to do competently. "You cook," I said, too surprised to make it sound like anything but an accusation. "I find it settles things." She didn't look up from the pan. "You mentioned on the train that your father used to make something with thyme on Sundays, before things went wrong for your family. You didn't finish the sentence. I didn't think you were listening. I listened to everything." She said it without weight, a simple fact, the way she said most things. But something in the set of her shoulders told me it cost her more than she let show. It seemed like the kind of thing worth finishing, even if you couldn't. I stood in that kitchen with the smell of thyme and browned butter thick in the air, and beneath it, closer now than it had ever been on a crowded train, black spruce and cold iron, and something that had been guarded and cautious in my chest since Monday's coffee simply gave way. Not to anything as dramatic as attraction, not yet, not fully, but to the specific, dangerous relief of being remembered by someone who had no reason to remember anything about me at all. "Sit," she said, nodding at the stool across the counter, and I did. And for 40 minutes we talked about nothing that mattered. Trains, the harbor traffic, a rumor about a dock workers' strike, and everything that did. The careful unspooling of two people learning each other's rhythms, one small exchange at a time. It was in that same kitchen, a week later, that I first heard the name Corinne Ashby. I hadn't gone looking for it. The Kessler shell vendor had led, over 11 straight days of cross-referencing, to a holding company registered under a name that meant nothing to me until I mentioned it in passing, expecting Adira to shrug the way she shrugged at most things I brought her. She didn't shrug. She went very still, the pan in her hand forgotten on the burner, and when she spoke her voice had dropped into a register I hadn't heard from her before, flat and careful in the specific way people get when they are working hard not to feel something in front of a witness. Say that name again. Ashby Holdings. It routes through 3 shells before it lands anywhere real, but I traced it. Corinne Ashby is the registered owner. I watched her face for a reaction I didn't understand yet. Does that mean something to you? She was my mother's closest friend for 20 years. Adira turned off the burner with a precision that felt like violence contained. She sat at our table every Sunday of my childhood. She spoke at my mother's funeral. A pause, long enough that the silence itself became information. My mother died of heart failure 4 years ago, at 58, 3 months after Voss Maritime nearly collapsed under a debt no one could explain. I always thought it was bad luck. I did the math before she finished the sentence, the way I did math on everything, and the shape of it turned my stomach. It wasn't bad luck. No, Adira said. I don't think it was. She looked at me across the counter, and for the first time since the train, I saw something in her face that wasn't armor at all. I think someone I trusted with everything spent 20 years deciding exactly how to take it from me, and I think you just found the first proof of it in a stack of invoices nobody else was patient enough to read. The kitchen had gone very quiet. The thyme and butter smell suddenly sharp against the new cold in the room, and outside the window, the harbor traffic moved on, indifferent. While inside, I felt the ground shift under both of us at once, because if Corinne Ashby had built Ashby Holdings to bleed Voss Maritime slowly enough that no one noticed, then somewhere in the wreckage of my own family's history, in the ledger my father had died still trying to balance, there might be a name that matched. I didn't say it out loud yet. I wasn't ready to hear the answer. Adira set the pan aside entirely and came around the counter, close enough that her scent settled over the kitchen like weather, and said, I need you to keep pulling that thread, wherever it goes, whoever it touches, even if it touches you. Especially then. Her hand found the counter beside mine, not quite touching, close enough that I could feel the heat of it. I've spent 4 years believing my mother's death was an accident of stress and bad hearts. If it wasn't, I want to know exactly how not, and I want to know from someone I trust to tell me the truth even when it's ugly. She looked at me, gray eyes steady, and something in her voice dropped lower, quieter. I trust you, Wren. I don't know when that happened. But it did. It was the first time she'd used my name instead of Miss Calloway, and it landed in my chest like a struck bell, ringing long after the moment passed. I went back to my office that night and didn't leave until 2 in the morning, chasing Ashby Holdings through 11 years of filings, and somewhere around midnight I found my father's name. Desmond Calloway, staff accountant, Voss Maritime, terminated for cause 9 years ago on suspicion of embezzlement he never confessed to and never stopped denying, dead of a heart attack 14 months later at his kitchen table with unpaid legal bills stacked beside him and his daughters asleep down the hall. I sat with that name on my screen for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. The same shell structure, the same signature pattern, a full 4 years before it ever touched the Voss family directly. My father hadn't stolen anything. My father had found exactly what I'd found, and somebody had made very sure he never got the chance to prove it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my new desk in Voss Tower, with my father's ruined name glowing on the screen in front of me, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that the debt I'd spent 9 years believing was mine to carry in shame had never been my father's at all. I told Adira everything the next morning, in her office, with the door closed and the city gray and rain streaked behind her. She listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood at the window with her back to me, her shoulders set in a line I was already learning to read, as grief wearing the shape of control. 9 years, she said finally. She's been doing this for at least 13. My mother trusted her with everything, and I let her keep half a board seat out of loyalty to a woman who's been dead 4 years, because I couldn't imagine anyone capable of what you just showed me. I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it. I crossed the room and stood beside her, close enough now that the black spruce and cold iron settled over both of us like a held breath. My father died believing he'd failed his family. He died believing it was his fault. If Corinne Ashby did to him what she's been doing to you, then I don't want quiet justice for this. I want it in the open, where everyone who ever looked at his name and flinched has to watch it get corrected. Adira turned to face me, and for the first time since the train, she reached out and touched me. Just my hand, just her fingers closing loosely around mine, testing, deliberate. "I'm not going to promise you quiet," she said. "I'm going to promise you this instead. Whatever it costs, however long it takes, I will not let Corinne Ashby walk away from what she did to your father or my mother. That's not comfort. That's a fact. The same way your numbers are facts. That sounds like a vow. It is one." Her thumb moved once across my knuckles, slow, deliberate, and her voice dropped into something quieter, rougher at the edges than I'd ever heard it. "I keep what's mine counted and covered, Ren. I always have. I'm telling you now, so there's no confusion later. You're mine to keep covered too. If you'll let me." The rain kept falling against the window, and somewhere 4 floors below us, the ordinary business of Voss Maritime carried on unaware that its foundation had just cracked open. And I stood there with my hand inside hers and understood that whatever this was becoming between us, it was no longer something I could tell myself was only proximity and exhaustion. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted. "Being someone's anything. I've spent my whole life being useful to people and invisible to everyone else. You're not invisible to me." Adira's grip tightened, just slightly, an anchor rather than a demand. "You haven't been invisible to me since the 3rd morning I saved that seat, and you sat down in it like you had every right to, which you did. I'd been watching you for 2 weeks before that. I knew your coffee order before I knew your name. Something in my chest went entirely soft, undefended, dangerous. That's either the most romantic thing anyone's ever told me or deeply alarming." The corner of her mouth moved, the ghost of the almost smile from the train, warmer now that there was no newspaper between us to hide behind. "With me," she said, "it's rarely only one thing." We were still standing like that, her hand around mine, the city gray and wet beyond the glass, when her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom with the flat, careful tone people use to deliver news they already know is bad. Corinne Ashby had requested an emergency board session for that afternoon, agenda unlisted, and asked specifically, by name, whether the new hire in forensic accounting would be attending. Adira's hand went still around mine. "She knows," she said quietly. "Somehow, she already knows what you found." The board session took place in a room built to intimidate, all dark wood and a table long enough to seat 20, though only 9 chairs were filled when Adira walked in with me half a step behind her, my tablet clutched to my chest like a shield. I knew Corinne Ashby before anyone introduced her, because there was only one woman in the room whose smile arrived a full second before her eyes agreed to it. She was elegant in the particular way of women who have spent decades being underestimated on purpose, silver-threaded carefully through dark hair, a voice pitched for boardrooms and funerals alike. "Adira, darling," she said, rising halfway from her seat, "and you've brought your little train friend. How resourceful." "Miss Calloway is head of forensic review," Adira said, taking her seat at the head of the table without looking away from Corinne once. "She'll be presenting today, not attending." "Presenting what, exactly?" Corinne's eyes flicked to me, assessing, dismissive in a way I recognized from 4 years of Marcus's coffee-stained mornings, the specific cruelty of someone deciding, before you've spoken, that nothing you say will matter. I'd hoped to discuss the unfortunate rumors circulating about irregularities in the Kessler account. "I understand there's been some confusion." Understandable, given the source. "There's no confusion," I said, and I felt every eye at the table land on me at once, the old instinct to shrink rising fast and hot before I forced it back down. I opened my tablet instead, and I let the numbers speak the way they always had, clean and undeniable. 3 years of Kessler transfers routed through Ashby Holdings projected onto the screen behind me for every board member to see. Corinne's smile didn't move. That was the thing I noticed, the thing that told me she'd known this moment might come and had rehearsed her face for it. Shell companies are common in freight logistics, she said smoothly. I'd be careful drawing conclusions from a junior hire's first month of work. Grief can make people see patterns that aren't there. I understand your father struggled with something similar, didn't he, years ago, before his unfortunate passing? The room went very quiet. She'd said it lightly, almost kindly, the way a knife goes in lightly when the hand holding it knows exactly where to aim, and I felt the old shame rise in my throat, 9 years of practiced apology, waiting to spill out of me the way it always had. I didn't let it. My father found the same pattern I found, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, steady the way numbers are steady. Same shell structure, 4 years earlier, same signature discrepancies down to the transfer amounts. He lost his job, his name, and eventually his life trying to prove what I just proved in 11 days, with better resources and someone willing to listen. I'd be careful drawing conclusions about who's seeing patterns that aren't there. Miss Ashby, given that the pattern has your name on the deed filings twice. Something flickered behind Corinne's composed face, fast and involuntary, gone almost before it arrived. But I saw it, and beside me I felt Adira go very still in the specific way of a woman recalculating an opponent she'd underestimated. This meeting is adjourned, Adira said into the silence that followed, rising from her chair with a calm that didn't match the tension coiled through the room. Corinne, you'll hear from legal counsel by end of week. Everyone else, thank you for your time. Corinne rose too, gathering her things with unhurried grace, and as she passed me on her way to the door she paused, close enough that I caught a scent under her expensive perfume. Something faintly bitter, chemical, wrong. You should be careful, Miss Calloway, she said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. Your father made the same mistake. He thought being right would protect him. She left before I could answer, and I stood in that boardroom with my hands shaking and my father's name still glowing on the screen behind me, and understood that whatever quiet justice I'd imagined finding for him had just become something considerably more dangerous. That night, Adira walked me to my car in the parking structure beneath Voss Tower, and for the first time since the kitchen, she didn't fill the silence with anything. She just stayed close, her shoulder nearly brushing mine, until we reached my car and she stopped, turning to face me under the flat fluorescent light. She threatened you, Adira said. It wasn't a question. I heard the tone even from across the room. She's done worse to people before, hasn't she? Priya warned me the first week. People who get close to you get used as leverage. That was true once. I intend to make sure it isn't true again. Adira's jaw tightened, and beneath the black spruce and cold iron I caught that bitter thread of anger again, held carefully in check the way it always was, like she'd trained herself years ago never to let it fully loose. I want you to move into the tower residences. Not the visitor floor, my floor. Security is tighter there, and I would rest considerably easier knowing you weren't alone at night while she's still circling. Petra needs me. I can't just... Then Petra comes too. She said it simply, like it had never occurred to her there was another option. There's space, there's better care for her condition than what you've been managing alone. I'm not asking you to give anything up, Ren. I'm asking you to let me make the thing you're already carrying lighter." I should have said no. I'd spent 9 years building a life out of not needing anyone, out of carrying every weight myself so no one could ever again take something from me by pretending to help carry it. But I looked at her standing there under the ugly fluorescent light, offering me safety with no strings I could find, no matter how hard I searched for them. And I thought about the torn sleeve on her coat, mended badly by her own hand, and I understood that this woman didn't know how to want quietly. She only knew how to want completely, the way she did everything else. "Okay," I said. "Yes, both of us." Something in her face eased, just slightly, the coiled tension of the boardroom loosening by 1 degree. "Good," she said. And then, quieter, almost to herself, "I don't think I could have slept tonight otherwise." I didn't kiss her that night. It would be 2 more weeks before either of us said the thing plainly enough to act on it. But standing in that parking structure with Corinne Ashby's threat still ringing in my ears, I understood that whatever was building between us had stopped being something I could call a fluke of proximity days ago, and I was no longer sure I wanted to stop it, even if I could. Moving into the tower changed the shape of my days more than the salary or the office ever had. Petra took to it with the ruthless efficiency of a 16-year-old handed an elevator with a private code, and within a week she'd charmed the entire kitchen staff into keeping a standing supply of the sour candies she liked, and cornered Priya Okafor in the gym long enough to demand, with the imperious confidence only teenagers manage, whether she could learn to use the security cameras for justice. "Your sister," Priya told me, with something that might have been the beginning of fondness under her usual flatness, "is either going to run this company in 20 years or get arrested trying to hack it." I haven't decided which. The storm hit on a Tuesday, the kind of storm the harbor city took seriously, power flickering across 3 districts by early evening, the tower's backup generators kicking on with a low hum that ran through the floors like a heartbeat. I'd been working late in the forensic office, cross-referencing a 4th Ashby shell company that had surfaced that afternoon when Priya's voice came through my phone, tighter than I'd ever heard it. "Security breach, sublevel 2, she said. Someone tried to access the server room with a cloned badge. We caught it before anything was pulled, but I want you and your sister with Adira until we clear the building." Now, Ren, the walk to Adira's floor took 4 minutes I spent counting every step, and when the elevator doors opened, she was already there, coat gone, sleeves rolled, a stillness in her that I now recognized as barely contained fury rather than calm. "Ashby," I said, before she could speak. "It has to be." Priya's tracing the badge signature now. Adira's hand found my shoulder, steadying either me or herself. I couldn't tell which. "Where's Petra? Asleep?" I checked before I came up. I hadn't realized how badly my hands were shaking until she took one of them in both of hers, holding it still. "You're safe," she said. "Both of you are safe. I promise you that." The lights flickered again, the generators stuttering under some new load, and for a moment the office went fully dark, storm black. Nothing but the sound of rain against the windows and both our breathing gone suddenly loud in the quiet. When the emergency lighting kicked back on, dim and red tinted, we were standing closer than either of us had let ourselves stand before, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her, close enough that her scent, black spruce and cold iron, filled every space between us that fear had left open. "I keep thinking," I said, my voice unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the storm, about what she said to my father. That being right wouldn't protect him. "I keep waiting for you to tell me she's wrong. She's wrong." Adira's hand came up, slow, deliberate, and stopped just short of my face, giving me the full length of a heartbeat to pull away if I wanted to. I didn't. Being right didn't protect him because he was alone when he found it. You're not alone. I have made a great many mistakes in my life, Ren, but I promise you I will not make the mistake of letting you carry this by yourself. Tell me to stop, she said, so quietly it was almost lost under the rain. Her thumb finally, gently, brushing my cheekbone. And I will. Don't stop, I said, and the words came out on something between a breath and a plea, and then her mouth was on mine, careful at first, restrained in the particular way that told me exactly how much control she was spending to keep it careful, and I felt something in my chest that had been clenched since a Monday morning coffee spill finally, fully let go. It was the first kiss neither of us apologized for afterward. We stood there in the red emergency light with the storm rattling the windows and Priya's voice crackling somewhere on the radio about a cleared building and a traced badge signature that led, unsurprisingly, to a contractor with financial ties to Ashby Holdings, and I understood. With my forehead resting against Adira Voss's collarbone and her heartbeat loud and fast beneath my ear, that whatever this had started as, it had become something I was no longer willing to lose. We didn't talk about what the kiss meant that night. We didn't need to. The storm did enough talking for both of us, and by the time the power stabilized near midnight, Adira had made up the guest room adjoining her own without either of us discussing it, close enough that when I woke twice from dreams about my father's kitchen table, I could hear her moving quietly on the other side of the wall, awake too. It was 3 nights later, over a dinner she'd cooked herself again, this time something with rosemary that tasted like nothing from my childhood at all, but felt somehow like being taken care of anyway, that she finally told me about her mother. She built this company from 4 ships and a loan she never should have gotten, Adira said, turning her water glass slowly on the table, not quite looking at me. My father left when I was 6. It was always just the 2 of us after that, her running Voss Maritime and me learning, from the time I could walk, that control was the only thing that kept us safe. She used to say it like scripture, keep what's yours counted and covered. I must have heard it 1,000 times before I turned it into something I believed on my own. That's where you got it, the thing you said to me. In your office. It's the only inheritance she left me that I've never managed to put down. Adira's jaw worked, and for the first time I watched the iron current's careful composure crack open, just slightly, just for me. She trusted Corinne with everything. I watched her do it for 20 years and told myself that kind of trust was a strength, right up until the year the company nearly collapsed and my mother's heart gave out 3 months later, and I decided the lesson was that trust itself was the mistake, that control was safer, that the only person I could rely on absolutely was myself. And now? Now I have watched a woman I met on a train find in 11 days what I couldn't find in 4 years because she was patient enough and brave enough and generous enough to look for the truth even when it cost her something. Adira reached across the table and laced her fingers through mine, slow and certain. I think I had the lesson backward. I think the mistake was never trust. I think it was who I chose to give it to. I told her about my father that night too, the parts I hadn't put in any report, the way he used to hum while he worked, some half-remembered tune from a childhood near the water, the way he'd apologized to me the week before he died for a failure that had never been his, the way I'd spent 9 years since believing, on some unexamined level, that being careful and quiet and small was the only way to keep from ending up like him. You're not small, Adira said when I finished, her thumb tracing slow circles against my knuckles. You never were. You were just surrounded by people too careless to notice what you actually were. We didn't sleep in separate rooms after that." Nothing more happened than sleep. That first night, her arm around me, her scent settled deep into the sheets, my back against her chest while the city hummed quietly beyond the windows. But it was, I would think later, the truest kind of intimacy either of us had let ourselves have in years. The kind that asked for nothing except to be trusted with the whole, unguarded weight of another person. The warmth lasted 11 days. It ended on a Thursday, with Petra's school calling my phone at 2 in the afternoon to say she'd never arrived for her afternoon classes, that the last anyone had seen of her was getting into a car in front of the building that wasn't the car service Voss Tower had arranged, that no one had thought to question it because the woman driving had shown identification, had smiled, had said she was a family friend picking Petra up as a surprise. I knew before Priya finished pulling the security footage. I knew the moment I saw the elegant, unhurried way the woman on the grainy feed opened the car door for my 16-year-old sister, the same rehearsed kindness I'd watched arrive a full second before her eyes agreed to it in a boardroom 2 weeks earlier. Corinne Ashby had taken Petra. The message came 40 minutes later, delivered not to me but to Adira directly. A single line with no signature needed because none of us doubted for a second who'd sent it. Call off the forensic review, or the girl doesn't come home the way you'd like her to. I read it twice and felt the floor of my life drop out from under me entirely. The careful architecture of safety I'd built over 11 good days, collapsing into something that tasted like 9-year-old grief and fresh terror at once. Petra, who charmed security guards and demanded justice from a gym treadmill, who was the only family I had left in the world, was somewhere in this city with a woman who had already destroyed one member of my family and clearly believed she could destroy another without consequence. "We're finding her," Adira said, and her voice had gone somewhere I hadn't heard it go before, flat and lethal and entirely without the careful restraint she usually wore like armor. She was already moving, already on the phone with Priya, already pulling every resource a shipping empire's worth of power could summon down onto one address. "I promise you, Ren, we are finding her tonight." I stood in the middle of that office with my sister's empty desk chair from home somehow vivid in my mind, the one with the sticker she'd never let me peel off, and understood that the worst thing I had ever imagined had just walked calmly through the front door of my life, wearing an elegant coat and a rehearsed smile, and that whatever came next would cost every one of us more than we'd been prepared to pay. Priya traced the car through 11 traffic cameras in under 20 minutes, a service record leading to a private dock warehouse on the Eastern Harbor that Ashby Holdings had quietly leased through its third shell company 6 months earlier, long before I'd ever found the first thread of it. Adira had a team assembled before the trace was even confirmed, and I watched the iron current become something the papers had never quite captured. Not cruelty exactly, but a will so absolute it bent the room around it. Every person in that office moving at a speed dictated entirely by the flat, controlled fury in her voice. "You're staying here," she told me, checking the clip on a radio with hands that were, I noticed, not quite steady despite everything else about her holding firm. "She's my sister. And you are the only person who can testify to every dollar Corinne Ashby has stolen for 13 years, which means if anything happens to you tonight, everything we've built collapses, and she walks away clean." Adira's hand cupped my face, briefly, fiercely, gray eyes locked on mine. "I need you safe so I can bring Petra back to someone. Let me do this. Please." I hated it. I hated every rational piece of the argument even as I recognized its shape, and I hated more the particular helplessness of standing in a war room while people I loved moved toward danger without me. But I nodded, because Petra needed at least one of us thinking clearly, and clear thought had never once been possible for me while I was afraid. They found the warehouse at 9:47 that night. I know the time, because I was watching the clock the entire 11 minutes it took Priya's team to breach the perimeter, counting seconds the way I'd once counted an empty train seat, because counting was the only thing that had ever made unbearable waiting survivable. Petra was unharmed, frightened, furious in the specific way of teenagers who resent being frightened more than the thing that frightened them, but unharmed, and the moment I got the call, I made it to the warehouse in 19 minutes flat, breaking every traffic law the city had on the books. Corinne Ashby was not there when the team arrived. She'd left Petra with 2 hired men and a warning, and slipped away before anyone could close the net, which told me, standing in that cold warehouse with my sister's arms locked around my waist, that whatever came next would not end quietly, because a woman who ran rather than faced the consequences of her own scheme was a woman still convinced she had more moves left to play. She did. 2 days later, the story broke across every outlet in the city, allegations sourced anonymously that Voss Maritime's new head of forensic review had fabricated evidence against a beloved company matriarch out of a personal vendetta rooted in her father's old, unproven embezzlement case. My name was in 3 headlines by morning. My father's disgrace, resurrected and repackaged, sat beside mine in cold newsprint, and somewhere in the mess of it, unattributed but unmistakable, was Corinne Ashby's honeyed, careful hand. I sat in Adira's office, reading it with my sister curled against my side, and felt something in me that had survived a coffee spill and a firing and a kidnapping finally, quietly, begin to crack. They're going to believe her, I said. They believed her about my father. Why would this be different? Adira crouched in front of me, taking both my hands, her voice steady even though I could see, underneath it, the same fury still burning that had sent her tearing across the city 2 nights before. Because this time, she said, you're not alone with the truth. You have me, and everything I have belongs to proving it. And I am done, Ren, being careful with a woman who murdered my mother by inches and nearly took your sister to keep herself hidden. She made this public. Fine, we finish it in public too. Petra, unfazed by kidnapping in the specific way only teenagers manage, looked up from her spot against my side and said, with total confidence, also, she's clearly evil and everyone's going to figure that out eventually, so honestly, this is kind of dumb of her. It was, absurdly, the first thing that made me laugh in 2 days, and Adira's mouth twitched despite everything, the ghost of the almost smile from the train finally, briefly, breaking through. Your sister, she said, is entirely correct. Let's go prove it. The board convened again 4 days later, this time with the financial press seated in the gallery Adira had insisted on opening, because a fight this public, she said, deserved a public ending. I stood at the front of that long, dark table with a presentation 11 days and 1 kidnapping in the making, every transfer, every shell, every forged signature laid out in a chain that ran unbroken from my father's ruined name to Petra's terrified 2 hours in a harbor warehouse. Corinne arrived 20 minutes late, immaculate as ever, and took her seat like a woman who still believed the room belonged to her. I understand emotions are running high, she began, before I'd said a word, given the unfortunate incident with Miss Calloway's sister. Deeply concerning, and I've asked our security team to look into who might have. You can stop, Adira said, and her voice cut through the room like something physical. We have the leasing documents for the warehouse, Corinne. We have the badge clone traced to a contractor on Ashby Holdings' payroll. We have 13 years of shell transfers with your signature on the founding paperwork, And we have a recording, taken by my head of security the night my sister in all but name was found, of one of your hired men naming you directly in exchange for a reduced sentence. I watched something in Corinne's face finally, fully break, the rehearsed kindness sliding off like a mask that had simply run out of adhesive. "You have no idea," she said, low and venomous now, no honey left in it at all, what it cost me to stand in that woman's shadow for 20 years while she got everything I built alongside her. "Your mother took credit for half of what made this company what it is, and when I finally started taking back what I was owed, in small enough pieces that no one would ever..." She stopped herself. Too late. The confession already out in front of the recording device Priya had quietly activated at the start of the session. Desmond Calloway got too close. I did what I had to. And when your mother's heart finally gave out from the stress of watching her precious company falter, I confess I didn't grieve as hard as everyone expected. The gallery had gone completely silent. I watched 13 years of careful, patient cruelty pour out of a woman who had, apparently, wanted someone to finally ask the question for a very long time. And beside me, I felt Adira go rigid with a fury so absolute it frightened me, her hand finding the edge of the table like she needed something to hold on to besides the urge to cross the room. "Have security take her into custody," Adira said, her voice gone dangerously quiet, "and get the police on the line." Now, Corinne rose, still trying for composure even as two of Priya's people moved toward her. "You'll regret this," she said, to Adira, to me, to the whole room. "Everything I did, because your mother never once. That's enough." I hadn't planned to speak again, but I felt Adira beside me coiled to say or do something the cameras in that gallery would carry for years, something that would cost her more than Corinne Ashby was worth, and I put my hand over hers on the table. "Let the law have her. She's already given us everything we need. She doesn't get anything else from either of us." Adira looked at me for a long moment, gray eyes still burning, and then, slowly, the coiled violence in her shoulders eased, replaced by something quieter, something that looked almost like relief at being stopped. "She's right," she said, to the room, to Priya's people already moving Corinne toward the door. "Take her out. Let the courts finish what we started." The gallery erupted the moment the doors closed behind Corinne Ashby, reporters already typing, board members already talking over each other. And in the middle of all that noise, Adira turned to me, took my face in both hands, and said, quiet enough that it belonged only to the two of us, "I told you I'd keep what's mine covered." I meant that. I still do. "I know," I said. I felt it every step of the way. Outside the boardroom windows, the harbor caught the last of the afternoon light, and for the first time in 11 days, the air in the room felt like something we could finally actually breathe. The formal charges against Corinne Ashby were filed within the week, 13 counts of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy, with a 14th added once investigators traced a direct financial link between Ashby Holdings and the false testimony that had ended my father's career 9 years earlier. My father's name, cleared in a single afternoon by a district attorney's press release, ran in the same papers that had once printed his disgrace, though this time the headlines used the word vindicated instead of suspected. And I read them standing in Adira's kitchen with Petra crying happy, furious tears against my shoulder and Adira's hand steady on my back the entire time. Marcus, I learned later through Dara Kim, who'd texted me the update with 3 exclamation points and a string of gleeful emojis, was fired from Halloran Bookkeeping within the month. Once it emerged in the fallout that he'd been the one who'd tipped off Ashby Holdings that a new hire was pulling at the Kessler thread in exchange for a payment small enough to be almost insulting. My old supervisor, whose willful blindness had cost me nothing less than my father's stolen years, lost the firm's largest client when Voss Maritime formally severed the relationship, a move Adira made without my asking and mentioned only in passing, the way she mentioned most acts of quiet, devastating loyalty. Priya Okafor, who'd warned me my first week that people who got close to Adira got used as leverage, found me alone in the tower gym 3 days after the board session, and instead of another warning, set an unmarked box on the bench beside me. "For your sister," she said, gruffly, not quite meeting my eyes. "She's been asking about the security systems for a month. Figured someone should actually teach her properly instead of letting her guess." Inside the box was a training manual, and tucked beneath it, a small enamel pin shaped like a compass. And that's for you. In 15 years working for that family, I have never once seen Adira Voss wait for anyone the way she waited for you on that train. Don't let anyone ever make you think you weren't worth the wait. I didn't cry in front of her, mostly, but it was close. Nell, the housekeeper who'd run the Voss household since before Adira could walk and treated the tower's top floor like a kingdom she alone understood, cornered me in the kitchen the same week with a tin of the thyme stew recipe written out in careful, looping handwriting. "Her mother used to make this," she said, pressing it into my hands. Adira watched her do it 100 times and never once asked to learn, because learning it felt like admitting her mother might not always be there to make it. "She's made it 3 times for you now. That's not nothing, dear girl. That's a woman handing you something she spent years too frightened to hold herself." It was Dara, though, over lunch on the tower's ground floor the following week, who put words to the thing I hadn't let myself say plainly yet. "You're happy," Dara said, not a question, studying me over a sandwich with the particular scrutiny of a friend who'd watched 4 years of Marcus's cruelty land on me without once being able to stop it. "Actually happy, not the pretend kind you used to do so well. I think I am." I turned my water glass slowly, an old habit I'd apparently caught from someone else. I keep waiting for it to be a mistake. For someone to tell me it doesn't add up. "Ren," Dara set down her sandwich, "you solved a 13-year embezzlement scheme, cleared your father's name, and got adopted by a shipping empire's most terrifying CEO, who by every account cooks you dinner and saved you a train seat for 2 weeks before either of you spoke. I don't think you need the math to confirm this one. I think for once in your life, you're just allowed to have something good." That evening, walking back up to the tower's top floor with the last of the sunset bleeding orange across the harbor, I found Adira on the terrace, coat off, sleeves rolled, looking out at the water the way she always did when something was turning over in her mind. "I keep thinking about the first morning you sat down," she said, without turning. I'd told myself for 2 weeks it was ridiculous, saving a seat for a woman who'd never once looked at me twice. And then you sat down like you belonged there, and I understood I'd been waiting for exactly that, whether I admitted it to myself or not. You could have just said something. Weeks earlier. I'm better with numbers on a page than words out loud, apparently, for all the good my education did me. The almost smile again, fuller now than it had ever been on the train. She turned to face me fully, and something in her posture had changed, a stillness that felt less like armor and more like a held breath. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know, before I do, that there's no version of the answer that changes how I feel about you. I only want the truth. Ask me. Would you let me claim you?" Her voice had gone low, careful, every ounce of the iron current's usual command stripped out of it and replaced with something far more vulnerable. "Not tonight. Not until you're certain, and not until every part of this is fully, completely your choice. But I want you to know the offer exists. because I have never once in my life wanted to give someone my name and my bond both, and I want to give them to you. I thought about the seat that had waited empty for 2 weeks before I ever sat down in it. I thought about a stew that tasted like a childhood I'd thought I'd lost, about a torn coat sleeve mended badly by a hand that could have bought 1,000 new coats and chose instead to keep the old one whole. I thought about my father's cleared name and my sister's laughter down the hall, and a woman who had turned an entire company's power toward finding one kidnapped girl because she'd promised to keep what was hers covered. Ask me with your words, I said, echoing the gate she'd given me weeks before, watching her eyes flare bright at the sound of her own vow handed back to her. When you're ready to ask it properly. I'll say yes. I want you to know that now, so there's no confusion later either. She crossed the space between us and kissed me there on the terrace with the whole harbor spread out gold and darkening beneath us, careful and certain both at once, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely and completely seen. Corinne Ashby's trial was mercifully brief, the evidence too complete for any defense to survive it, and she was sentenced 11 weeks later to 18 years, the judge noting for the record the particular cruelty of a scheme that had destroyed one family in silence and nearly a second one in violence. I sat in the gallery for sentencing with Petra's hand tight in mine and Adira's shoulder pressed against my other side, and when the gavel came down, I felt something in my chest finally, fully unclench after 9 long years of carrying a grief that had never once been mine to carry alone. The proposal came 3 months after that, on a Tuesday of all mornings, on the 7:12 out of Ashford Terminal. I hadn't expected it. We still rode the commuter line together most mornings by then, some stubborn, sentimental habit neither of us had been willing to give up, even with a private car sitting unused in the Tower garage, and I'd settled into what had long since become, without either of us formally declaring it, our seat, when Adira reached into her coat. The same coat, I realized with a jolt, the tear at the sleeve finally, properly mended with matching thread, and produced a small box. I've rehearsed several versions of this, she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, the Iron Current's steady voice shook, just slightly, at the edges. All of them started with numbers, because that's the language I trust, and none of them felt like enough. So I'll just tell you the truth instead. I watched you for 2 weeks before I ever spoke to you, and I have never in my life wanted anything the way I wanted you to sit down in that seat. You did. And every day since, you have made a life I thought was already finished into one I actually want to keep living. I would like to keep a seat open beside me for the rest of it, if you'll let me. I would like to give you my name and my bond and everything I have left to give. Half the train car had gone quiet, watching, the way strangers do when they sense something rare unfolding in front of them, and I laughed, half tears already, because it was so entirely, perfectly her to propose on public transit with the exact same steady gravity she brought to board meetings and embezzlement confrontations alike. Yes, I said, before she'd even finished opening the box properly. Yes, obviously, yes. The claiming came on our wedding night, 5 months later, in a ceremony small enough to fit the people who actually mattered. Petra as my only attendant, fierce and radiant in a dress she'd picked herself, Priya standing stiff and visibly emotional at Adira's side, Nell crying openly in the second row, Dara heckling gently from the back until Petra shushed her. We said vows we'd written ourselves, and when Adira reached the end of hers, she set aside the paper entirely and looked at me with her whole undefended face. I will always find the light on, she said, echoing the small, private promise she'd made me on a stormy night months before, the one I'd carried through every dark hour since. I will always keep a seat open for you. Whatever else changes, that will not. That night, in the quiet after the celebration, she asked me one final time, her mouth at my scent gland, her whole body gone still with the particular restraint I had come to understand as the deepest expression of how much she wanted something. "Tell me to stop," she murmured. "And I will." "Don't stop," I said, and meant it with everything 9 years of carried grief had finally, fully let go of. And when her teeth found my skin, the bond settled into place between us like something that had always belonged there. Warm and certain, black spruce and cold iron and brown sugar and warm wool woven together into a single, inseparable thread. A year on, the tower garden held a party loud enough to draw complaints from 3 floors below, Petra newly 17 and insufferably pleased about it, Priya laughing. Actually laughing, a sound I'd learned was rarer than diamonds, at something Dara had said, Nell fussing over a cake she'd insisted on baking herself despite the caterer's protests. Marcus's name came up once, in passing, when Dara mentioned he'd finally found work at a firm 3 towns over that clearly hadn't checked his references closely enough. Nobody at the party wasted more than a sentence on him. Corinne Ashby's name didn't come up at all, which felt, more than any headline ever could have, like the truest kind of justice. A woman who had spent 13 years trying to matter, rendered finally, completely irrelevant. Adira found me at the edge of the garden near the end of the night, her hand settling warm over the small, new curve of my stomach that only the 2 of us knew about yet. A secret we were saving 1 more week to share properly with Petra. "Regretting the seat yet?" she asked, the old nickname, Ice Queen, I still called her sometimes. The insult the papers had coined turned, over a year, into the softest kind of endearment between us, warm in her voice now instead of cold. "Never once," I said, "not for a single day." We rode the 712 together most mornings still, even now. Even with a nursery half finished in the tower and a wedding ring I still sometimes turned in disbelief. The seat beside her had a small brass plate fixed to the armrest these days, unofficial and entirely her doing, engraved with 2 words that made the conductor smile every time a new passenger asked about it: reserved, always. On a bright morning some months later, sunlight fell clean and gold through the train's window, catching the mended tear in an old gray coat folded now in a drawer at home rather than worn. Retired the day Adira finally let herself buy a new one, and catching too the brass plate on the seat where I sat every morning beside the only woman who had ever looked at an invisible, exhausted, quietly furious accountant and seen, immediately and completely, someone worth saving a place for. I used to believe that being useful was the only kind of belonging I would ever be allowed. I know now that the 2 were never the same thing, that being seen costs nothing from the person doing the seeing, except the willingness to actually look, and that the bravest thing anyone ever did for me was save an empty seat for 2 quiet weeks and wait, without a single guarantee, for me to be ready to sit down in it. The end.